This podcast assumes that you have a general knowledge of the Tate LaBianca murders. Sharon Tate Polanski, Jay Sebring, Wojciech Frykowski, Abigail Folger, and Stephen Parent were murdered on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles on August 9, 1969. Lena and Rosemary LaBianca were slain in their Los Feliz residence the following night. Charles Manson, Charles Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Quenwinkle, and Leslie Van Houten were convicted of those murders. Say hello to the Goodbye Helter Skelter podcast. Hi, I'm George Stimson, and this is the 11th installment of the Goodbye Helter Skelter podcast. I spent the first 10 episodes of this podcast summarizing my own book, Goodbye Helter Skelter. Now, I'd like to take a look at some of the other books that have been written about Charles Manson and the Tate LaBianca murders. And I thought I'd start with Manson, The Life and Times of Charles Manson by Jeff Guinn. I chose Manson to review first because it is a book that has gotten considerable attention since its publication in 2013. Its author, Jeff Guinn, has been ubiquitous on programs about Manson since that time, appearing in numerous documentaries as an expert on Manson and his life. I hadn't read Guinn's book prior to working on this review, but from seeing him on television, I knew that his opinion of his subject matter was very negative, that he hewed to the Vincent Bugliosi line that Manson was the dictatorial head of the family, and that the Tate LaBianca murders were committed in order to trigger the race war helter-skelter with all of its peculiar attributes. In other words, I hadn't read Guinn's book because I didn't think it had anything of value that would add to my understanding of Charles Manson and his case. But still, it was worth some consideration, because I saw Guinn on television so many times, and he spouted Bugliosi's spiel so well that I actually thought he had been picked by the powers that be to be Bugliosi's official media replacement after the DA approached and was overtaken by death in 2015. My impressions of Manson? I have about as many problems with Guinn's book as the book has pages. In fact, the problems literally begin on page 1, where Guinn, in retelling Greg Jacobson's famous story about Charles Manson clearing the dance floor at the Whiskey A Go-Go, makes a seemingly offhand comment about musicians who desire to be more famous than the Beatles. If that triggers your Bugliosi helter-skelter alarm, there's good reason. That's because Guinn buys completely into every aspect of the flawed Bugliosi scenario of Charles Manson and his friends, his so-called family. Fundamentally, Guinn presents Manson as the dictatorial head of a group of persons he intentionally recruited to be members of this so-called family. As an adjunct to this, Guinn also buys completely into helter-skelter being the motive for the Tate LaBianca murders, with all of its details, including the supposed secret messages from the Beatles and influences from the biblical book of Revelations. He repeatedly fosters the notion that Charles Manson was a megalomaniacal musician who thought that his music would make him more famous than the Beatles, a theme that, as I said, is introduced on the very first page of the book. Finally, and most outrageously, Guinn blames the entirety of the negative happenings in Charles Manson's life in 1969, and for his whole life in general, on the contention that Manson was just a fundamentally bad person.
Charles Manson is literally one of the worst human beings that ever walked this planet.
Let's look at these problems individually in some more detail. Problem number 1. Guinn's take on Manson is that he was basically a pimp who used pimping techniques to gain control of his followers, first by flattering them and then making them dependent on him by isolating them, feeding them drugs, and gradually converting them to the reality he wanted them to have. The purpose of this was not, apparently, to make money by actually pimping the girls out for money, but rather to collect a group of followers that would reinforce his position as the leader of the world after the race war helter-skelter. It has been popular lately to emphasize the pimp aspect of Manson's character. And to be sure, there is some foundation for this, since Manson did engage in some low-level pimping during the 1950s and in 1960. And the Manson family phenomenon does conjure up an initial image of a dominant male surrounded by devoted females that could be interpreted as a pimp-girls situation. But except for one experimental instance recalled in Lynn Fromey's book Reflection, none of the women around Manson ever actually turned any tricks, so there is a major element missing from the pimp analogy equation. The flattery aspect of pimping does seem to apply to the way Manson complimented the women in his life, but it could also be possible that at this point in his life, Manson had learned that being pleasant and accommodating might result in pleasantness and accommodation in return. And where might he have learned that being nice to people could make them be nice to him? Instead of considering the possibility of this behavior pattern being something that Manson picked up from his life experience, Guinn ascribes Manson's congenial personality to a book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, by Dale Carnegie.
Above all, let me stress this again. He is not crazy. This is a smart man, a manipulative sociopath who cobbled together all kinds of things and used them to his own advantage. Maybe some of you have by now heard the Dale Carnegie story, which seems to be what the media is really picking up on about this book. I went to Nashville, Tennessee, and found Phil Kaufman, an old prison mate at Charlie's who later got in the music business as a roadie and is most famous when his buddy Graham Parsons, the musician, died, of stealing Parsons' body and taking it to Joshua Tree Monument to burn it, because that's what Parsons had said he always wanted. Anyway, Kaufman, who's now 76 years old, a big, huge guy with a gray handlebar mustache who came to our lunch riding the biggest Harley I'd ever seen in my life, I said, Phil, I got to know, all I hear from people is how when they met Charlie Manson, it was like he looked into their soul and he started talking about what they wanted to talk about, that he just had this amazing knack for winning people over right away. I mean, was it something mystic? Did you see this? And Kaufman laughed so hard and slammed his fist down on the table, and my iced tea spilled everywhere. And Kaufman said, I've been waiting almost 50 years for somebody to ask me that question. And I said, well, answer it. And Kaufman said, in prison, Charlie signed up for the Dale Carnegie course. The prison was trying to teach inmates how to function better on the outside. And he would come back to the cell and practice the lines that he'd learned in class that day, not because he wanted to make friends and influence people, but because he wanted to be a pimp when he got out. And he was going to use these lines to try to recruit girls for his string. So I sent off, I got copies of the classroom materials that they would use in McNeil Prison back in those days, and was reading the book. Then I go out to Corona to interview Leslie Van Houten and Patricia Krenwinkel, and I asked them both separately, because you can only talk to one at a time, what did Charles Manson say to you when you first met him that made you want to follow him? And they said, well, Charlie said this, this, this. Word for word out of chapter 7 in How to Win Friends and Influence People.
If you haven't read this book, you really should. Not only is it very interesting generally, but it also does give the reader valuable insights in how to relate to other people. But to contend that the techniques in this book enabled Charles Manson to collect a group of followers so devoted to him that they would commit mass murder for him is to suggest that anybody who read the book could do the same thing. So, if you've ever fantasized about being the next Charles Manson, what are you waiting for? If the Manson as pimp scenario doesn't fly, is there some other social group with a dominant male, submissive females, and male hangers-on that we could possibly compare Manson and his friends to? I think a more appropriate description of the social situation, certainly as it existed at Spahn's Ranch in the summer of 1969, would be that it was like a wolf pack in every regard. Problem number 2. Guinn perpetuates the Bugliosi fantasy that the Tate LaBianca murders were committed in order to trigger a race war. Guinn accepts that all of Bugliosi's supposed supporting evidence for Helter Skelter, such as the Beatles prophesying it and the biblical references to it in the Book of Revelation, was fervently believed by Manson and his friends.
He was convinced there was going to be a shooting war and the blacks were going to annihilate the whites. Just real quickly, this is on a tangent, but I'll get back to your question. Manson preached to his followers that there was going to be helter skelter, a black-white race war, and Charlie and the family would go to the Mojave Desert where they would hide during the war in a bottomless pit. And when the war was over, the blacks would win, but they were not bright enough to be able to actually govern themselves afterward. So Manson and his followers would emerge from the pit, and they would take over and, in fact, rule the world. Yeah.
Gwynn's dismissive yeah is better directed at Bugliosi for promoting such a motive, rather than at Manson and his friends for supposedly believing it. I wrote an entire book arguing against Helter Skelter being the motive for the Tate LaBianca murders, and other authors have as well. Although, amazingly, big media and much of the general public still subscribe to the Helter Skelter motive, no serious student of this case does, and the fact that Guinn so fervently embraces it only demonstrates how far off of reality's rails he is. Problem 3. Guinn also often repeats the untruth that Charles Manson wanted to be a recording star more famous than the Beatles.
Charlie Manson, listening to the radio in prison, hears the Beatles. He starts writing his own songs, performing in prison shows. What a mad delusion, living in that confusion. From then on, it's his dream to become the biggest musical star in history.
In fact, Guinn claims that Manson's dream of becoming a music superstar was the driving force behind everything he ever did. But the truth is, Charles Manson knew that he was unsuited for success in the entertainment industry, and thus he didn't seek it. Besides, a Manson fantasy of being the most famous performer in the world would seem to be at odds with his equally supposed desire to start a race war. If a cataclysmic race war was raging and Charles Manson and his family were hiding in the bottomless pit in Death Valley, how would people be able to go to record stores to buy his music? Problem number 4. Gwynn's hostility towards his subject is unrelenting. According to Guinn, there is nothing positive about Charles Manson. Manson was a master manipulator who took advantage of everyone he ever met and left a trail of ruined lives in his wake.
Charles Manson is literally one of the worst human beings that ever walked this planet.
According to Guinn, Manson was a no-talent con who annoyed just about everybody he ever came into contact with. Nobody enjoyed being with him. His family was only around him because he used threats, coercion, and violence to keep them in the fantasy world that he created for them, in the vacuum of their isolation from real family members, friends, and away from the outside world in general. Of course, if that was true, you would expect that those people would have been liberated from the Manson monster by his final arrest. But how does the life of misery with Charles Manson, recalled by disenchanted former associates and friends, jibe with the loving support he got from his co-defendants and friends after his arrest and during the trial? It doesn't. Jeff Guinn is the author of dozens of books, both fiction and nonfiction. Here he is as he explains the thought processes that go into his book writing.
When I write nonfiction, I basically start with the single premise that events never happen in a vacuum. Anything is a result of many past actions, where different people grew up, what they thought, how they mixed together, who they met. There's no one simple answer to anything.
No simple answer, he says. But wait, in this case, there is a simple answer to the mystery of the Charles Manson phenomenon. Charles Manson was just a very bad person. The main thing that struck me about Guinn's book is the obvious loathing that he has for his subject.
Charles Manson is literally one of the worst human beings that ever walked this planet.
And why was Charles Manson literally one of the worst human beings that ever walked this planet?
Charles Manson was born evil. Little Charlie was taken in by loving relatives. The problem was that Charlie himself was a rotten little kid from the word go.
This theme starts early in the book, and it's basically how the whole book goes. Charles Manson was bad. He was dishonest and criminally inclined. He only interacted with other people so that he could take advantage of them. He was a pariah. Here is how Guinn introduces his readers to the 5-year-old Charles Manson. Little Charlie Manson was a disagreeable child. Beyond his doting grandmother, who still recognized his many faults, few who knew him then or in his ensuing teenage years found much to admire about him beyond his looks. It was possible to pity the boy. He didn't have a father, and now his unreliable mother was in jail. And Charlie was so small that he was closer in stature to toddlers than to other kids just turning 5 and about to enter school. But even at such a young age, he lied about almost everything, and when he got in trouble for telling fibs or breaking things or any of the other innumerable misdeeds he committed on a daily basis, Charlie always blamed somebody else for his actions. The child was also obsessed with being the center of attention. If he couldn't get noticed for doing something right, he was just as willing to attract attention for misbehaving. You couldn't ever relax when Charlie was around. It was only a matter of time before he got up to something bad. The whole Manson phenomenon, it's really that simple. Manson appears impressive because it is seemingly well sourced. Over 70 pages of the book are spent listing the sources for Guinn's information. But those long lists of sources, as well as many of the sources themselves, are open to questions. One of Guinn's journalistic coups was landing interviews with Manson's cousin Joanne and his adopted half-sister, the same adopted half-sister who would later make a claim to Manson's estate after his death. Many of the recollections about Manson's childhood come from Joanne and the half-sister, who never knew Manson. The cousin's recollections of Manson, as recounted by Guinn, are without exception negative. The early portion of the book is full of her supposed ill feelings for him. The sentiments gleaned from the evaluation of 5-year-old Charles Manson in the introductory paragraph quoted above likely came from her. Or rather, they are more probably a product of Guinn's interpretation of whatever she told him. In any case, it is not honest to use her alleged feelings as a sole source for an accurate account for that period of Manson's life. The ill feelings of the cousin were not reciprocated. Manson later remembered her well and with fondness. The sister mostly supplies information she gleaned from Manson's mother, Kathleen Maddox Manson. According to Manson, his mother abandoned him to a life of institutions because she didn't want to take care of him. Guinn says that's a lie, and instead presents a daughter-painted picture of a woman who really wanted to get along with her incorrigible son, but was always kept from doing so because she was trying to get her own hectic life together. Which of these perceptions is true? There's no way we can say. But when it comes to how Charles Manson perceived his reality, the only perception that counts was his. A detailed examination of the book would be almost impossible because there are so many things wrong with it. There is either a factual error or substantial misrepresentation of facts on almost every page. Many of the detail errors are minor, like that Sandra Good had a trust fund when she actually didn't, or that Joel Pugh associated with Manson and his friends when he actually didn't, or that there were pastures at Spahn's ranch when there actually weren't. But other claims are not so minor. Guinn repeats the oft-told assertion that Lynn Fromey had sex with George Spahn. But until someone can cite a source from either Fromey or Spahn, or an eyewitness corroborating that claim, that baseless fantasy allegation should be forever consigned to the same pile of waste from whence sprang the minds of the people that originated it. Gwynn's assertion that Gary Hinman cooked up and sold drugs, mostly speed, would certainly be libelous if Hinman wasn't dead. But there is one statement of fact that is so off base that it is worth a closer look here. After him stating it, and I mean repeatedly, Guinn never again deserves to be taken seriously about anything regarding Charles Manson or the Tate LaBianca murders.
They come back to Spahn Ranch. Manson is waiting for them. And one by one he interrogates them. Not just did they kill people, how much money did they get. He's very upset that they only had about $80 in cash that they'd taken. But what's most important to him, what he keeps haranguing them about, how did you leave the bodies? Did you make it look dramatic? Are they going to think that the Panthers did this? He's not satisfied with the answers. He gets in the car that they had been driving in, goes back by himself and rearranges things at the murder site. I said to Pat, how do you know for sure he did that? She said during the trial, when they brought out the photographs of the death scene that the cops saw, she said, Leslie and Susan and I couldn't believe it. We were saying, well, no, that chair wasn't there. There was a big American flag that they found draped over the couch, and then Sharon Tate's bloody body next to the couch. The flag had been hanging on a corner of a closet in another room. And Manson obviously got the flag and brought it out, trying to make sort of a more dramatic statement.
Obviously, Manson went back. That's the only obvious conclusion to Krenwinkel and Van Houten having different recollections of the crime scene as to what's depicted in the crime scene photos. That's a more obvious conclusion than the possibility that the girls misremembered. But the girl, Pat, not Leslie, who wasn't at Cielo Drive, must have misremembered the part about the American flag. Because not only did the housekeeper testify that the flag had been on the couch for some time, but there is also photographic evidence of the flag being on the couch before the murders. Much of Gwynn's descriptions of life with Manson in 1968 and 1969 are sourced to interviews that Guinn did with Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten. And while that might sound impressive, there are no transcripts of the actual interviews, prison visits really, so we can't see what the girls actually said and compare that to Gwynn's conclusions. Since both Krenwinkel and Van Houten have soured on their relationships with Charles Manson since 1969, it is not surprising that their recollections of their lives with him are negative. But despite what they might say now, neither can deny that at the time of the murders they loved Charles Manson, and they loved him for reasons that were valid then, even if they don't regard them as valid now. For some of Manson's associates, that love lasted longer than for others. But as for the still imprisoned members of the family, after years of separation from their former friends and untold hours of counseling, they have forsaken the values and commitments they made in 1969. And what better explanation for their 1969 deeds can they offer other than that they must have been influenced to do things out of their range of thinking by an older, evil, manipulative con man? And Leslie and Pat also can't deny that they both want to get out of prison, and that a major step in them achieving that goal is to completely renounce Manson and any aspect of their lives with him. But the horrible memories they recall now don't jibe with the photographic evidence of their moods at the time, when they were obviously joyous. And when you consider that their negative statements are extrapolated further by Gwynn's own prejudices, and then finally tweaked for the maximum public sales appeal by the editors at Simon & Schuster, you're talking about secondhand hearsay at best, and it should be regarded as such. Apparently, in Guinn's research, he couldn't find anybody who had anything good to say about Charles Manson. Guinn says that he tried to talk with other members of the Manson family, but to no avail.
I found some family members. I tracked almost all of them down. And as you can see from the book, a few did talk to me and were very cooperative. Most of the others wanted money to talk. Their current asking price is $25,000 an interview. But unfortunately, Simon & Schuster wouldn't up my advance to make this possible, so I had to regretfully tell them no. But there were a few that I found.
I have a pretty good idea of who he is talking about there, and it's for sure not anybody that I've ever met. Guinn's book has been widely accepted, and it was even a New York Times bestseller. And if you've ever wondered, that designation is achieved when a book sells 5,000 copies within 1 week. Given Guinn's previous reputation as an author and the fact that Simon & Schuster aggressively marketed the book, it is not surprising that Manson achieved that goal. Rolling Stone included Manson among its top 9 books about Manson and the Tate LaBianca murders. The other 8 books were Helter Skelter, Chaos, Member of the Family, Manson in His Own Words, The Manson Women and Me, The Girls, and Restless Souls. And we'll be getting to some of these later. In its review of Manson, the Stone wrote, "While the book doesn't conclusively identify the origins of Manson's evil, a feat that would be impossible, it does render him a fully three-dimensional figure, a major departure from previous efforts depicting him as a crazed, cold-blooded killer." Doesn't conclusively identify the origins of Manson's evil, a feat that would be impossible. Other reviews noted the same problem with Manson. If Guinn's book has a flaw, it is that Manson, for all his clamorous bustle and toxic charisma, remains a cipher. We are never entirely certain how much method is in his madness, nor whether he actually subscribes to the theories he spouts. You're not going to fully understand Manson and his actions after reading this book. Who really can? What these reviews were learning for is an explanation for a Charles Manson who didn't exist. A Charles Manson who, in Guinn's words, was literally one of the worst human beings that ever walked this planet. Do you know the real reason why Jeff Guinn's Manson can't explain the origins of Charles Manson's evil? Because Charles Manson wasn't an evil man. He was just a man. This has been the Goodbye Helter Skelter podcast, the podcast dedicated to the truth about the Tate LaBianca murders, Charles Manson, and more. The views expressed on this program are solely those of the individual speakers, and they do not necessarily represent the thoughts, ideas, or opinions of any other persons, either living or dead. Visit our companion website at www.goodbyehelterskelter.com. There you can find more information about this podcast. Also, check out the Goodbye Helter Skelter Facebook page for information on upcoming programs. And let us know what you think by way of contact@goodbyehelterskelter.com. We will address any comments, questions, or concerns on future installments of the Goodbye Helter Skelter podcast.